Priyanka. In a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone is familiar with one another and life typically unfolds without surprises, the morning begins with an unexpected call to the police. Concerned neighbors gather, and bewildered family members try to make sense of it all. The house, at first glance, seems untouched, no sign of forced entry or struggle. Everything appears to be in order. Yet one unsettling detail breaks the illusion. A woman sits unnaturally calm in an armchair by the fireplace. Clues suggest a quick, meticulously executed act, but something doesn't quite align. Neighbors claim no one came or went during the night, and her husband maintains he left for his usual morning run, everything routine. Then why does a photograph rest on the table, showing the couple together, with the haunting caption, "Forever"? Let's begin a tale steeped in shadows, where every truth is buried beneath layers of careful deception. It was a quiet August morning in February 2010, just before dawn, around 5 a.m. As always, Satish was the first to rise. The house remained hushed, and he moved with practiced silence, careful not to disturb its peace. In Holy Mount, a serene neighborhood nestled in southern Bangalore, Satish was known as a modest man, someone who barely made a ripple in the lives around him. But beneath that quiet exterior were thoughts far more complex, ones that surfaced during his solitary morning runs. These moments were his, reserved for reflection on his career, his ambitions, and the future he imagined with Priyanka. At 5:40, as he stepped out the door, he paused, casting a final glance at the windows behind him. Inside, Priyanka was likely beginning her morning yoga, a ritual she held dear. These early hours grounded her, providing strength and clarity before the demands of the day took over. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's move on with the video. She taught mathematics at a prestigious school on Kanakapura Road, known for its high standards and demanding curriculum. Her colleagues and students saw her as a strict but caring teacher, and parents often expressed gratitude for the genuine attention she gave to their children. Satish and Priyanka had moved to Holy Mount a couple of years ago, renting a home on a quiet street where family bonds were strong and houses stood shielded from prying eyes. This was a neighborhood where neighbors had known each other for decades and rarely intruded into each other's personal lives, which suited Satish Gupta very well. Their life was calm and steady, and they blended in seamlessly with the other families around them. Although they rented, their house became a sanctuary, and Priyanka infused it with warmth and a cozy atmosphere, which even occasional guests felt when they came by for tea. But there were aspects of their life known only to them. They didn't have children, a topic that occasionally came up with others, but they didn't make an issue of it. Within their marriage, Satish and Priyanka found harmony. They were comfortable together, and it suited them to shape their future as they envisioned it. They had decided to channel their efforts into acquiring a home of their own. A real place of strength, where they could invest not only money, but also their hearts. About 2 months ago, this idea finally began to take shape. They chose a plot on the outskirts of the city, among hills and fields, where they would build their home. The anticipation of this project had become a new source of inspiration for them. Satish's morning route wound through quiet streets just beginning to stir, the city's early rhythm matching the flow of his thoughts. It was 6:40 a.m. when Satish returned from his run. His steps had slowed and his heartbeat was steadying. But then his phone vibrated, showing Priyanka's name on the screen. She rarely called him at this hour, so he immediately felt a sense of unease. Her voice was tense and anxious. She explained that 2 strangers had appeared near the house, introducing themselves as paper collectors, and asking if they had any old newspapers or scrap paper. It was a common enough request, but there was one strange thing. They looked at her in an unsettling way. In their neighborhood, it was rare to see anyone that early, especially collectors. Plus, the stores were still closed and the streets were empty. Satish's pulse quickened. He immediately told Priyanka not to go near the door, and promised he'd be back as soon as possible. Nearly running toward the house, he couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. The whole situation felt strange and illogical. And the closer he got to home, the stronger a cold fear took hold. As he reached the porch, he saw that the street was empty. The so-called collectors were gone. The porch was silent and still. He rang the doorbell, expecting Priyanka to answer right away, but there was no response. The silence felt too loud, too charged. He tried calling her again, but her phone was silent. His unease turned into genuine fear. Satish realized he didn't have a spare key, and Priyanka likely had her key on her. That meant he couldn't get inside, and with each passing second, his anxiety grew stronger. Almost feverish with worry, he decided to rush back to the office, where they kept an extra key. All he could do was hope that Priyanka was okay. When he finally returned and opened the door, his hands were trembling. He stepped inside, immediately sensing something was wrong. The air in the house was thick and tense, as if it concealed a terrible secret. As he entered the living room, Satish froze. Priyanka was there, tied to a chair, her arms bound to the armrests. A deep wound crossed her neck, and blood was slowly pooling on the floor. A chill ran through his body, as if everything inside him had turned cold. On autopilot, he reached for his phone, dialing for emergency services. The words he spoke sounded hollow, as if they didn't come from his own voice. He called the police, barely aware of what he was saying, as if in a trance. Officers from the Holy Mount precinct arrived almost immediately, but they didn't need a briefing on what awaited them inside. Each of them froze at the sight of the tragic scene unfolding in the living room. People accustomed to confronting brutal acts were struck by the sight of Priyanka, tied to the chair, amid the remnants of a once cozy home, now shattered by this horrific event. The lead investigator gave a composed order that no one was to touch the body or any furniture until the forensic team arrived. Though even he couldn't immediately pull his gaze away from the tragic scene. The room held no trace of the people who had done this. No obvious clue left behind. All that remained was pain, bitterness, and an overwhelming silence. Satish stood in shock, unable to look away from the scene unfolding before him. When his parents arrived, they rushed to his side, but he remained trapped in his own horror, as if numb to everything around him. Words failed everyone. Priyanka's parents didn't hear the terrible news until the next morning. In a house that, just a day before, had been filled with plans and hopes, now only a crushing silence lingered. All that remained of Satish's former life was memories. His sobs, punctuated by deep breaths, echoed through the empty house, leaving no space for sound, no room for peace. The officers, though accustomed to horrific scenes, tried to stay at a respectful distance, avoiding his gaze. The pain was too raw. One officer attempted to approach, offering him a glass of water, but Satish didn't respond. He seemed locked within his own thoughts, his stare fixed on the spot where life had once held its warmth. Meanwhile, the police began a thorough examination of the house, leaving no corner unchecked. Those two mysterious paper collectors Priyanka had mentioned became a particular point of interest. And officers immediately started questioning neighbors and others in the area. But to their surprise, no one had seen or heard of these individuals. The statements created a puzzle. Where had these strangers gone? Satish was adamant that they were the reason he felt alarmed enough to come back early from his run. Despite his certainty, a hint of doubt crept into the officers' minds. As they investigated further, another odd detail emerged. Cash and jewelry were missing. With difficulty, Satish explained that he had been setting aside money to buy his wife a car as a surprise anniversary gift. It was his little secret, a plan he had carefully saved for, intending to create a joyful surprise. But now, his savings were gone, along with Priyanka's jewelry, which had meant so much to her. The amount stolen made police wonder if this crime could have been a robbery. However, the absence of any sign of forced entry presented a mystery. It looked as if whoever committed this act knew exactly what they were looking for and had planned every detail. The following morning, Priyanka's family received her remains, and Satish took on the difficult task of arranging the ceremony for her cremation. The service was held in silence, broken only by the heavy sighs and quiet sobs of those in attendance. Friends and relatives, devastated by what had happened, came to pay their respects, struggling to believe the reality before them. Priyanka's parents stood by Satish, their faces reflecting an inexpressible grief and unanswered questions. Their daughter's life had ended so abruptly, so tragically, that they found it hard to grasp the truth of it all. While officers combed through the house, the story was quickly gaining public attention. Before the funeral was even over, reporters had gathered outside, eager for any information about what had happened. News of the tragedy spread across Bangalore, shocking a city that, though no stranger to crime, was deeply disturbed by this incident. The community demanded answers. People wanted to know who could have committed such an act, and what could have driven this level of cruelty. Calls for justice echoed from all sides and accusations of police inaction began to circulate. Satish felt time slipping away with the investigation seeming to stagnate. He couldn't accept this sense of injustice. One day, he walked to the police station and without going inside, sat down right outside the entrance. His resolve was clear. He would stay there until the police found the person responsible for his wife's death. With each passing day, his protests drew more attention. At first, passers-by stopped out of curiosity, but soon his silent demonstration became a talking point in the papers and on the news. Journalists began interviewing locals, many expressing sympathy, while criticism of the police grew. Why was the search taking so long when fresh clues should have been available? Why wasn't there more progress? Each day Satish returned to those stone steps, sitting in quiet mourning as people passed by, moved by his grief. Some paused to offer condolences, others brought him water, and occasionally he received notes of encouragement. The police, unsure of how to respond, tried to convince him to go home, assuring him they were doing everything possible, but Satish held firm. Meanwhile, the officers were not idle. They dug deep into every aspect of Satish and Priyanka's life, interviewing friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Every account they heard was the same. There were no signs of tension, no arguments between the couple. They had led a peaceful, happy life. And no one had a single doubt about their harmonious relationship. The investigators couldn't find evidence of enemies or grudges, leaving them with only more questions. All signs pointed to Satish and Priyanka as a typical, contented couple. What then was the motive? Everything suggested a robbery, but why had it turned so violent? As time wore on, public dissatisfaction with the investigation mounted. Satish's ongoing protest outside the station was intensifying public pressure, causing many to question the efficiency and transparency of the police. In a short span, he had become a symbol of perseverance, his story spreading like wildfire across the city. Now, all eyes were on the authorities, waiting for answers. On the evening of August 13th, several officers observed his silent vigil and finally decided to bring him inside. A flicker of hope sparked in Satish, perhaps a breakthrough at last. But what awaited him was not what he expected. Once inside the station, Satish found himself encircled by officers, their demeanor shifting from cordial to calculated. They began picking apart his statements, probing for the slightest inconsistency. The questions turned sharp, zeroing in on the timeline of that crucial morning. When had he left for his run? At what time did he receive Priyanka's call? Exactly when did he return? Satish did his best to answer clearly, but with each response, the atmosphere thickened. Then came a critical detail. Priyanka's call was logged at 5:55 a.m., yet according to Satish's account, he hadn't returned until around 6:40. Yet they pointed out that the distance didn't quite match the time he claimed it took him to return. The officers were starting to pick up on small discrepancies in Satish's account, which only raised their suspicions further. They pressed harder, asking for specifics about his actions that morning, his exact return time, and why he hadn't answered Priyanka's call immediately. Finally, they brought up the spare key he had reportedly gone back to the office to retrieve. Satish explained that he had entered the building briefly, grabbed the key from a drawer and left without delay. However, the officers revealed that surveillance footage showed he hadn't passed through the turnstile at all. He had only lingered at the entrance before leaving. With each new detail, Sadish's nerves became more evident. Detecting this, the officers intensified their questioning, not allowing him room to avoid any answers. The question of how he could have retrieved the key without entering the office remained unresolved. Sadish insisted he had gone inside, but the camera footage suggested otherwise. According to Sadish, when he returned home, he unlocked the door and immediately found his wife's body. The sight had shocked him, but he claimed he had called the emergency services right away to report the tragedy. Sadish maintained that when he entered, he was alone with Priyanka. Neighbors confirmed that they hadn't noticed anything unusual that day. Residents on the floors above and below even remarked that if anyone had been asking for old newspapers, they would have known as collectors in their area always visited each apartment in turn. But that hadn't happened, and this only added more confusion to the investigation. Determined to unravel the truth, police began analyzing Sadish's statements closely, trying to piece together what had occurred in the Gupta household. Sadish insisted he had hurried home after hearing about the suspicious visitors from Priyanka. But as detectives dissected his version of events, they uncovered numerous inconsistencies. The more he recounted his story, the more tangled the details became. Sitting across from the investigators, Sadish's face grew increasingly pale as they circled back to his statements, studying his every reaction. The officers watched him carefully, noting how his gaze shifted and how his hands trembled ever so slightly. Every gesture, every pause, every change in tone became a potential clue. During the interrogation, investigators reviewed Sadish and Priyanka's phone data, which raised further suspicions. Records showed that their phones were within the same cell tower range at the time of her death, indicating that Sadish was nearby, even though he claimed to be out on his morning run. The entire story grew increasingly contradictory, and Sadish became visibly uneasy with each new question. His tale of the paper collectors seemed less and less convincing, and detectives began to suspect there might be an entirely different motive behind this crime. When officers examined the items found around the house, their suspicions deepened. A pair of dirty gloves, a set of boots, and a sleeveless jacket with stains were hidden in a dark corner under the stairs, as if deliberately placed out of sight. A pack of cigarettes also caught their attention. Neither Sadish nor Priyanka smoked, but there it was on the floor, as if someone had either carelessly left it behind, or intended to mislead the investigation. Forensic experts began to wonder, who could have left these peculiar clues? The autopsy report added new and disturbing details. Priyanka had not only suffered a wound to the neck, but was also strangled beforehand, followed by several non-lethal cuts to her abdomen. These injuries pointed to a calculated level of cruelty. Furthermore, there were no signs of struggle on her body, suggesting that she hadn't resisted the assault. Had this been a typical robbery, Priyanka would likely have tried to defend herself, and signs of a struggle would have been evident. Yet forensic analysis found none. When Sadish informed the police that cash and jewelry were missing from the house, they decided to conduct a thorough search of every nook and cranny. Surprisingly, despite his claims, a significant amount of cash, around 100,000 rupees, was discovered hidden in a discreet spot within the house. This raised new questions. How could Sadish have overlooked such a large amount? If this had truly been a robbery, the perpetrator would likely have taken everything of value. Further investigation revealed that Priyanka's earrings, a ring, and a necklace also hadn't been taken, which cast serious doubt on the robbery theory. During yet another interrogation, the detectives confronted Sadish with direct questions, showing him photos of Priyanka's jewelry. These items were valuable, and if a thief had indeed broken into the house, they would have taken them. Sadish hesitated, fumbling with his answers as the questions became increasingly pointed. His responses grew inconsistent, and the foundation of his story seemed shakier than ever. The investigators began to suspect that a more complex motive lay behind the crime, something deeper than a simple burglary. They began wondering if hidden tensions in Sadish and Priyanka's relationship might have led to this tragedy. As the questioning intensified, Sadish grew visibly more anxious. His responses became muddled, his sentences more disjointed. Initially, he denied any involvement in the crime, but as the pressure mounted, he finally broke down. At first, his voice was soft, uncertain, but then, as if something within him gave way, he confessed. Satish and Priyanka's story appeared to have started as a classic arranged marriage. In February 2007, their families agreed to the union, and although both Satish and Priyanka initially consented, differences began to emerge over time. Satish, a native of Bangalore, had strong family ties and was raised with a deep sense of tradition and respect for his parents. His loyalty to his family was unwavering, and frequent visits to his parents felt natural to him. Priyanka, however, came from Uttar Pradesh, where she was used to greater independence and believed Satish's primary duty was to her and their household, not to his parents. She expected his undivided attention, even suggesting at one point that he replace his family pendant with a locket bearing her photo, symbolizing that she should now be the focus of his life. Satish tried to find a compromise, but a couple of years into the marriage, the tensions grew worse. Priyanka persistently urged him to move into a separate home further from his family. Although it was difficult for him, Satish eventually agreed, hoping that the move would ease the strain on their relationship. They rented an apartment in the Holy Mount neighborhood, and for a while, things between them seemed to improve. But soon, Priyanka began pressuring him again. This time demanding that he reduce contact with his family, especially when his father's business encountered difficulties, and they needed some financial support. Satish wanted to help his parents, but Priyanka adamantly opposed it, forbidding him even from calling them. Resentment and anger built within Satish with each of Priyanka's remarks, especially considering that she maintained close daily contact with her own parents. For him, this was unbearable. Satish's resentment continued to fester, his disappointment gradually morphing into hatred, though he kept his emotions tightly concealed. By April 2010, it appeared things were finally improving. The couple had just bought a plot of land where they envisioned building their dream home. Family and friends gathered to celebrate the groundbreaking, offering their blessings and support. But the mood shifted abruptly when Priyanka refused to allow Satish's parents onto the property, stating that the land belonged solely to her and Satish, that his parents had no place in their future home. At the time, Satish was preoccupied with the ceremonial proceedings and only learned of the confrontation later from friends. The news hit him like a blow. He was stunned and deeply humiliated. In that moment, a line had been crossed, and he knew he would never truly forgive her. From then on, a quiet plan began to take shape in his mind, one he kept buried beneath the surface. Outwardly, he maintained the role of a loving, attentive husband, making every effort to convince Priyanka, and everyone else, that he had let the incident go. To those around them, it seemed as though their marriage had entered a harmonious new chapter, with the land purchase symbolizing a stronger, more united future. Yet deep within, entirely different emotions were brewing. He was developing his plan, masking it behind polite smiles and gestures of affection. Soon after, Priyanka began to experience health issues, prompting her mother to take her to Kerala for treatment involving Ayurvedic therapy. She stayed there for about 6 weeks, during which Satish frequently called her, kept up affectionate conversations, and even visited a few times, playing the role of a loving husband. This was all part of his act. He knew that by creating the image of a supportive spouse, he would leave no one suspicious of any malicious intent. When Priyanka returned home in early August, Satish had a surprise waiting. Aiming to strengthen her trust, he blindfolded her and led her into the living room. There, he removed the blindfold to reveal a large photograph capturing one of their happier moments together. The image, seemingly depicting an ideal family life, moved Priyanka deeply, and she felt herself trusting him again. Satish continued giving such gifts over the following days, reinforcing her belief that their relationship had finally reached a place of harmony. By the morning of August 10th, Satish had prepared a new surprise for Priyanka, one with an entirely different intention. He woke her up, hinting that he had something special planned and suggested blindfolding her to enhance the surprise. Priyanka agreed, suspecting nothing, and Satish gently guided her to a chair, explaining it was all part of their game. When her hands were secured to the armrests, he continued as if everything was going according to plan. This gift would be her last. Eager to see what she thought was another thoughtful gesture, Priyanka even suggested he tie her hands so she wouldn't accidentally ruin the surprise. Smiling, full of trust, she allowed him to use a nylon rope, completely unaware of what was about to happen. She tried guessing what the surprise might be. Perhaps a diamond necklace, she thought out loud. But instead of jewelry, Satish skillfully slipped the rope around her neck and began to tighten it. Priyanka, realizing the horror of the situation, struggled to free herself. But with her wrists firmly bound, she couldn't move. Satish stood silently watching her, taking in her tightly shut lips and wide terror-filled eyes. He kept pulling the rope until he was certain she was no longer breathing. But still unsure, he reached for a pair of gloves he had prepared to avoid leaving any evidence. With chilling composure, he then took a knife, and in a final act, cut her throat to ensure there was no chance she would survive. Knowing he now needed an alibi, Satish took Priyanka's phone and called his own number, making it appear as though she tried to reach him. After shutting off both phones, he went out for his usual morning run, where he conveniently encountered a friend. Someone he knew could later vouch for his whereabouts if questions arose. He returned home around 6:40 a.m., locked the door from the outside, and calmly walked to his parents' house, about 3 miles away. There, he borrowed his father's car and drove to his workplace, pausing briefly at the entrance to create another layer to his alibi. Leaving the car back at his parents' house, Satish walked home where the police were already waiting. As the police began scrutinizing his story, the first cracks appeared. On the surface, Satish's account seemed plausible, but as investigators spoke with Priyanka's family, troubling details emerged. Priyanka's relatives revealed that her married life with Satish had been far from happy. They claimed that right after the wedding, Satish and his family had begun to pressure Priyanka, sometimes even harassing her over minor issues. Many times she had called her parents, crying and seeking comfort. But they had tried to reassure her, urging her to be patient and believing things would eventually improve. 2 years into their marriage, when the situation became unbearable, Priyanka suggested to Satish that they move into a place of their own. In February 2010, they began renting an apartment in Holy Mount, hoping the change would ease tensions and help repair their relationship. However, the distance from his family did little to alter their attitude toward her. By the time of the crime, Satish's plan had fully formed and every detail began falling into place. According to Priyanka's relatives, they believed his family might have been aware of his intentions and perhaps even supported him, though there was no evidence to confirm this. As the investigation deepened, the police increasingly turned their attention to Satish, gradually piecing together evidence that led to his arrest. His trial dragged on for several years, shrouded in speculation and debate about what had truly driven his actions. Then, on July 28, 2017, the verdict was delivered. Satish was found guilty of the crime against Priyanka, as well as for tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison and ordered to pay a fine of 225,000 rupees, a judgment that stirred fresh waves of public interest and commentary. Behind bars, with his future irrevocably altered, Satish began assisting fellow inmates in their studies. His efforts helped some obtain educational qualifications, giving a sliver of meaning to his time in confinement. Years later, he sought to have his sentence reduced, pointing to his contributions within the prison system. But the court stood firm, unmoved by his appeal. And so, the grim tale reached its conclusion, a narrative woven with deception, half-truths, and buried intentions. When the truth finally surfaced, it left behind only silence and a trail of unanswered questions. As in life, this case served as a stark reminder: what lies behind closed doors often remains far more complex and darker than anyone dares to imagine. Moving on to the next case. Tammy Tracy. In 1987, 19-year-old Tammy Tracy lived in Rockford, Illinois, and worked as a dental assistant. She had graduated from Auburn High School the year before. Tammy was last seen on May 27, 1987, when she visited Searles Park to have her car waxed. Law enforcement searched for her for nearly a year. Billboards were put up to enlist public help in finding Tammy. Nearly a year later, on April 15, 1988, a bird watcher discovered her body in the Sugar River Forest Preserve in Durand. She was identified through dental records. An autopsy showed that she had been fatally shot. She had also been stabbed. On April 21st, she was laid to rest. In the picture, Richard Galvanoni reached out to touch her casket. He was the head of the Rockford Police Department's Detective Bureau who led the initial investigation into the case. Investigators said throughout the years that they were close to making an arrest. In February 2018, Tammy's mom, Linda Tracy, said, "I want to make sure they get him before I pass away." Early in February 2020, investigators claimed that they knew who took Tammy's life, but they were still working to accumulate the evidence needed to prove it. It's just a matter of having that one little piece of information that puts us over the hump that we could prove it in court. Finally, in November 2020, an arrest was made. 64-year-old Jesse Smith was arrested in Albany, Georgia, and indicted by a Winnebago County grand jury. He was a resident of Rockford at the same time Tammy's life was taken. Winnebago County State's Attorney, Marilyn Ross, said that Tammy and Jesse knew each other but did not elaborate. She also said that it would be inappropriate to talk about the new evidence that led to the arrest, and she also did not say what the motive was. Winnebago County Sheriff Gary Caruana and Rockford Police Chief Dan O'Shea both credited the tenacity of investigators for their work in leading to the arrest. Jesse Smith was initially held at Dougherty County Jail in Georgia before being extradited to Winnebago County. He faced a $5,000,000 bond. His attorney, Christopher Durango, revealed that Rockford police had obtained a letter from Jesse's ex-girlfriend, found in a safety deposit box, claiming he was responsible for Tammy's death. However, since the ex-girlfriend passed away several years ago, Durango argued that the evidence might not be strong enough. Tammy's mother, Linda, released a statement following the arrest. "We want to extend a heartfelt thank you to the Rockford Police Department, the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, Illinois State Police, and the Task Force. Thanks also to Lamar Advertising and Tricky Enterprises for their billboard support over the years. My heart is full of gratitude for all the prayers, messages, and calls. They meant so much to us. Tammy is finally resting, smiling down on all of you. At last we have found peace." Moving on to the next case. The Cho family. Betrayal in relationships isn't a crime and carries no legal penalty. Yet, it's a conscious act that wounds someone who has placed their full trust in you. Such betrayals can inflict deep emotional pain and sometimes trigger a series of events that escalate into real crimes. It's no surprise that Dante deemed betrayal the gravest of sins, sentencing traitors to the 9th circle of hell. From the very start, the story of Katie Cho felt unusual. At first, investigators wondered if the young woman had fled her strict parents, been kidnapped by one of her many online admirers, or taken an impulsive trip with someone without informing anyone. There was even suspicion that her parents might have had a hand in her disappearance. Sadly, Katie was never seen alive again. Strange behavior among people in her circle only deepened doubts. For over a year, the case went cold, until unexpected evidence emerged from the most unlikely source. Amazingly, the culprit had been right under everyone's noses the entire time, even managing to pass a polygraph test. Henry and Deborah Cho, Katie's parents, originally came from a small province in Taiwan. In 1989, they moved to the United States, settling in Renton, Washington, a city just outside Seattle. When they arrived, the couple barely spoke any English, making it very challenging to adapt to their new surroundings. They led a quiet, private life, seldom interacting with neighbors or the wider community. On April 21, 1991, they had their only child, a daughter named Katie. Unlike her reserved parents, Katie was cheerful, outgoing, and full of life. She naturally made friends easily, but her childhood was governed by strict discipline based on her parents' cultural values. Katie wasn't allowed to have friends over and had to constantly report her whereabouts and companions. As she grew older, This oppressive environment became increasingly difficult for her. Though Katie obeyed her parents, the rules often left her feeling stifled and lonely. In high school, Katie created several profiles on social media platforms, where she freely shared details about herself, her hobbies, and her life. Through these platforms, she found ways to socialize and bypass some of the restrictions her parents imposed. She even gained a modest level of online popularity, which helped her cope with her lack of freedom in the real world. When Katie began dating and showing interest in boys, her father's disapproval grew harsher. Henry criticized every young man she spent time with, deeply disliking the more relaxed and independent lifestyles of American teenagers. He firmly believed that his daughter should marry someone from Taiwan, not a local. Henry often confided in Deborah about his growing disappointment with life in America. He expressed regret about emigrating and frequently mentioned his desire to return to their homeland. The popular guy and the best friend. In the February, 18-year-old Katie Cho was in her senior year of high school when she began a romantic relationship with a young man named Ezekiel, or just Zeke Watkins. Zeke was 2.5 years older than Katie, but had attended the same Renton High School, so they had known each other since their teenage years. The relationship lasted only a couple of months, and during that time, Zeke never once visited Katie's home. They would meet in neutral places, or spend time at Zeke's apartment, which he shared with a friend. The reason for this was simple. Mr. Cho strongly disapproved of Zeke. He found the young man's unconventional appearance and bold behavior completely unacceptable. Zeke was a musician and had been a popular figure since his high school days. He always had plenty of admirers and frequently changed girlfriends. When he began to show interest in Katie, she was overjoyed. She was so determined to keep seeing him that she defied her parents' wishes and occasionally lied to her father to sneak out on dates with Zeke. However, after the new year, Katie's relationship with Zeke ended just as abruptly as it had started. Zeke's interest in her faded, and he soon began pursuing other young women. His new romantic interest turned out to be Jamie Marlowe, one of Katie's classmates and her closest friend. Whether it was intentional or not, the situation devastated Katie. Katie had genuinely loved Zeke. It was her first serious romantic relationship, something that had felt meaningful and full of potential. She was not ready to let go of him so easily and was determined to win him back. Naturally, her friendship with Jamie crumbled, and Katie now viewed her former best friend as both a rival and an enemy. At first, people around them assumed that Katie and Zeke had ended things on good terms, and continued to maintain a friendly relationship. Before long, though, Katie began going on dates with other young men, seemingly trying to prove to herself, to those around her, and especially to Zeke, that she was still desirable. However, this unorthodox approach and Katie's desperate attempts to reconnect with Zeke ultimately led to a tragedy. Where did Katie go? On April 19, 2010, Henry and Deborah Cho contacted local law enforcement to report their daughter missing. The night before, Sunday, Katie had gone out with friends, taking only her phone, and had not returned home. According to her parents, she was supposed to be back by 8:30 p.m. But when she didn't arrive at the agreed time, her father tried calling her. Strangely, Katie didn't pick up. It was completely out of character for Katie to ignore her father's calls, which immediately raised concerns. At 9:30 p.m., Henry Cho received a message from his daughter, Katie. She said she was having coffee with a friend at the local mall and would be home a little late. Naturally, this behavior frustrated her father, but he and his wife patiently waited for her to return. When midnight came and went without any sign of Katie, and her phone had been turned off, her parents grew increasingly alarmed. They began calling Katie's friends, but no one had seen her that evening. Taking matters into their own hands, Henry and Deborah went to the shopping mall themselves. By that time, the mall was already closed, except for the movie theater and a few cafes. But Katie was nowhere to be found. The tension in the Chu household continued to build, but the couple still hoped their rebellious daughter had simply stayed out too late and would return soon. By morning, with no word from her, Henry and Deborah went to the police station to file a missing person report. Katie did not show up for school that day. This immediately alarmed her teachers and classmates, as she had always been a diligent student who never skipped classes without a valid reason. On top of that, it turned out that Katie had not arranged to meet any friends the night before, leading her parents to suspect that she might have lied to them and gone on a date. The question was, with whom? This was something the police would need to figure out. The first suspect. Although Katie was only days away from turning 19, investigators treated her disappearance with the utmost seriousness from the very beginning. They immediately launched a search, interviewing her friends and acquaintances in an effort to gather any information that might provide a lead. Unfortunately, their efforts initially led nowhere. Detectives reached out to the cell phone provider and discovered that Katie's phone had last connected to a network at 9:30 p.m. The signal came from a local park bordering a large, marshy area. This revelation raised troubling questions. Katie had not been at the mall, as she had claimed. Instead, she had been in the park where she sent her last message to her father before turning off her phone. And it had not been turned on since. Detectives decided their first course of action would be to speak with Katie's ex-boyfriend Zeke Watkins and brought him in for questioning. The young man appeared visibly nervous but seemed genuinely concerned about Katie's disappearance. Zeke told investigators that he and Katie had broken up about 3 months earlier, but had remained friends. According to him, they had both moved on and were seeing other people, so there were no hard feelings between them. He even went on to suggest that Katie had been dating multiple people at the same time, although he claimed not to know the names of any of her supposed new romantic interests. When questioned about his whereabouts on the night his ex-girlfriend, Katie Cho, disappeared, Zeke explained that he had been at home with his roommate, Joe Carpenter. The two shared an apartment and had spent the evening playing video games until around 3 a.m., after which they went to bed. Zeke's alibi was supported by a neighbor who also knew Katie from school and was eager to help the police with their investigation. Zeke admitted that Katie had messaged him earlier that evening, asking to meet up. However, he told her he had other plans because he simply didn't feel like going out. The truth, he explained, was that Katie often tried to reconnect with him, and he assumed she wanted to discuss their relationship again. Not wanting to have that conversation, he made an excuse about being busy. On the surface, Zeke's story seemed believable. Still, investigators were reluctant to remove him from the list of potential suspects. His alibi had only been corroborated by his roommate, so detectives asked Zeke to take a polygraph test. After some hesitation, he agreed. The results largely confirmed his account, though a few of his responses weren't entirely clear. Investigators noted this as a minor discrepancy within the standard margin of error. Ultimately, they decided Zeke was unlikely to be involved in Katie's disappearance, and released him from further questioning. The next person investigators brought in for questioning was Jamie Marlowe, Katie's former best friend. The two had fallen out over Zeke, but their conflict had never escalated into an open confrontation, at least not publicly. Still, their friends were well aware of the tension between them. As previously mentioned, Katie had been trying to win Zeke back, a situation that understandably upset his new girlfriend, Jamie. But could Jamie have taken matters into her own hands and harmed Katie? It was a difficult question to answer. Jamie's behavior during the interview raised some eyebrows. She seemed unusually shaken and appeared close to tears while answering the detective's questions. When asked about her demeanor, Jamie attributed her emotional state to the stress of the situation. She admitted to having fought with Katie because Zeke had left Katie for her. However, Jamie firmly stated that she had no intention of giving up on Zeke as she too had strong feelings for him. Despite the tension between the two former friends, Jamie's alibi for the night of Katie's disappearance was solid. She had been attending a family celebration at a relative's house in a neighboring town. Jamie left the event just after midnight and went home with her parents and 2 older sisters. Her story was verified, and Jamie was quickly ruled out as a suspect. What were the parents hiding? Many of Katie Cho's friends noted that she was not only active on social media but also used dating sites, where she sometimes met new people. Recently, she had been going on dates with several young men, and rumors even suggested she was involved with multiple partners at once. Yet, no one seemed to know the identities of these mysterious individuals. Investigators believe that many answers could be found on Katie's laptop, which contained her accounts and private messages. However, the police soon encountered an unexpected obstacle. Katie's parents refused to allow them into the house, barred access to her room, and wouldn't let them take any personal belongings. Henry and Deborah's behavior appeared suspicious to investigators, as if they were hiding something. Authorities tried to explain that Katie's laptop might hold critical clues, perhaps the name of someone who wished her harm or was linked to her disappearance, and that specialists needed to access her online accounts. Despite this, Henry and Deborah stood firm and refused to cooperate. They insisted that they would take the laptop to a programmer they knew, who would unlock Katie's profiles. They promised to look through the contents themselves first, and then hand everything over to the police. On April 21st, investigators summoned Katie's parents for questioning, and suggested that they take a polygraph test. Deborah broke down in tears immediately, saying she could not go through with it. Henry reluctantly agreed, but he was clearly on edge. His behavior during the test was highly emotional. He would alternate between shouting and breaking down in tears while answering questions. In the end, Henry failed the polygraph, further intensifying suspicions surrounding the couple. Determined to uncover the truth, detectives decided to speak with the Cho's neighbors, and what they learned was intriguing. The neighbors explained that Henry and Deborah had moved into the house in 1989 after immigrating to the United States. But over the course of 20 years, they had never formed close friendships. The Cho family was known for keeping to themselves. They rarely socialized, never invited anyone into their home, and avoided visiting others. Even Katie's friends had never been allowed inside the house. The Chos weren't described as rude, they were simply private people who kept the outside world at arm's length. Henry and Deborah were deeply concerned about Katie's reputation and had always been wary of her friends and social activities. This concern, according to the investigators, explained their refusal to release the laptop. They wanted to know what their daughter had been involved in before handing it over. But why did they fail the polygraph? The answer turned out to be relatively simple. That day, April 21st, was Katie's birthday. She had been missing for 3 days, and her parents were at an emotional breaking point. Overwhelmed by worry, fear, and grief, they knew they were unlikely to pass the test because of their mental and emotional state. A few days later, Henry returned to the station voluntarily with Katie's laptop. This time, he agreed to take another polygraph test. The results showed that Henry was telling the truth, clearing him of any involvement in his daughter's disappearance. Katie's 8. Admirers. Katie Cho's parents feared that her laptop might contain private photos or videos that could damage her reputation, and they were determined to keep this from becoming public. Fortunately, nothing of the sort was found. However, investigators discovered that Katie had been chatting with 8 different young men online, and had gone on at least a couple of dates with each of them. Katie enjoyed male attention and often boasted about it to her friends. Some speculated that she was trying to make Zeke jealous. Regardless of her motives, every one of these young men now had to be investigated for any connection to Katie's disappearance. Thanks to her message history, police were able to identify their names, phone numbers, and even the dates and locations where Katie had met with them. Over the next couple of days, detectives managed to track down all 8 individuals and bring them in for questioning. The youngest was 17 years old, and the oldest was 24. Katie had met all of them online, and none of them had known each other previously. She had been the one to initiate contact and arrange the dates, but it was clear that she hadn't been in a serious relationship with any of them. Still, investigators considered the possibility that one of them had developed strong feelings for Katie, perhaps even to the point of becoming possessive or jealous. 5 of the young men had solid, verifiable alibis for the night Katie disappeared. 2 had been out of town, 1 was working an overnight shift, another was recovering in the hospital after a car accident, and 1 had spent the entire night at a bar with friends, a claim backed up by security camera footage. The remaining 3, who did not have airtight alibis, agreed to take polygraph tests and were cleared of any involvement in Katie's disappearance. a dead end in the investigation. For several weeks, search teams combed through the marshy area behind the park where Katie's phone signal had last been detected. Despite their best efforts, no trace of her was found. Investigators also came up empty-handed when searching for witnesses who might have seen Katie in the park that evening. Flyers with Katie's photo were posted throughout the city, and groups were formed on social media where friends and acquaintances shared information and theories about her disappearance. News outlets ran segments about the case, urging anyone with relevant information to come forward. The police received hundreds of tips from people claiming to have seen Katie the night she vanished, or even later, across different parts of the city. Unfortunately, every lead turned out to be a false alarm. In each case, it was a different young woman with a similar appearance, often of Asian descent. The investigation quickly reached a dead end. With no new evidence, leads, or witnesses to follow, progress stalled. By this point, few doubted that Katie was no longer alive. However, the mystery remained. What had happened to her? And who was responsible? The fear lingered that a dangerous individual was still out there, posing a potential threat to others. An unexpected clue. In April 2011, a year after Katie Cho's disappearance, some of her friends noticed something odd. Jamie Marlowe, who was still dating Zeke Watkins at the time, had started wearing black high-top sneakers with white platforms and distinctive lacing, exactly like the pair Katie had bought just weeks before she vanished. The shoes were unique enough that it was difficult to confuse them with any other pair. By then, Katie's former classmates had graduated high school and moved on with their lives, rarely seeing each other. Still, the rumor about Jamie's shoes spread quickly. Someone even managed to snap a photo of her wearing them and shared it on social media. Not long after, police received a call from a man named Giovanni Candelario, who claimed to have important information regarding Katie's disappearance. Giovanni was a friend of Joe Carpenter, Zeke Watkins' roommate. Back in April of the previous year, Giovanni had been staying at their apartment temporarily following a fight with his girlfriend. Despite this, he hadn't come up in the investigation and was never questioned by the police. He admitted to knowing Katie through mutual friends, questioned by the police. He admitted to knowing Katie through mutual friends, though they had never been particularly close. Giovanni told police that on April 18, 2010, the night Katie disappeared, Zeke hadn't returned home at 8 p.m., as he originally claimed. Instead, Giovanni recalled Zeke arriving closer to midnight. At the time, Giovanni had been playing a video game, but couldn't help noticing that Zeke was covered in mud. When Giovanni asked him about it, Zeke explained that he had been riding his bike off-road, fallen into a puddle, and gotten dirty. Shortly after, Zeke asked Joe Carpenter to come outside with him. Giovanni wasn't sure how long the two were gone because he had fallen asleep. When detectives asked Giovanni why he hadn't come forward sooner, he admitted that he hadn't thought much of the detail at the time. Zeke had been quickly ruled out as a suspect, and Giovanni himself was never asked to provide a statement. However, after witnessing Zeke's increasingly strange and aggressive behavior, and especially after noticing that Jamie was now wearing shoes identical to Katie's, Giovanni decided it was time to go to the police. At first, investigators were skeptical of Giovanni's story. They suspected he may have had a falling out with Zeke and was trying to get back at him. Nevertheless, his claims needed to be verified, so detectives brought Joe Carpenter in for another round of questioning, a chilling confession. Initially, Carpenter stuck to the same version of events he had given a year earlier. However, when investigators confronted him with Giovanni's statements, Carpenter's demeanor suddenly changed. He hesitated for a moment before asking, "What kind of sentence am I looking at for covering up a crime? Is there any way to reduce it if I cooperate?" Realizing the gravity of the situation, Carpenter struck a deal with the police. In exchange for leniency, he agreed to tell them everything he knew and to reveal where Katie's remains could be found. Carpenter went to great lengths to minimize his role in the events, insisting he had never wanted to lie to investigators in the first place. According to him, he had only kept quiet because he feared Zeke might harm him too. He confirmed that Zeke returned home around midnight that night, covered in mud. Carpenter also recalled seeing a fresh cut near Zeke's ear, which had gone unnoticed during the investigation because Zeke had a beard at the time. The shocking revelation. Zeke Watkins told his roommate, Joe Carpenter, that he needed help. He asked Joe to grab a small shovel from the trunk of his car. The two of them walked together into the marshy area behind the park, trudging through about 50 yards of overgrown brush. There, they stopped near Katie Cho's lifeless body. Zeke claimed that everything had happened accidentally, that he had only been defending himself, and begged Joe to help him hide the body. Together, they dragged the body deeper into the dense thicket, moving another several dozen yards until the brush became nearly impassable. There, they dug a shallow grave, placed Katie inside, and covered her with dirt and branches. Even a year later, Joe was able to lead investigators to the exact burial spot, using a large fallen tree nearby as a marker. Zeke was arrested the same day, but he vehemently denied committing a crime, insisting that it had been an accident. He admitted that he had agreed to meet Katie that day after she messaged him, but he claimed she had been aggressive and confrontational. According to Zeke, Katie was still trying to reconcile with him, and had openly told him as much. To avoid drawing attention, Zeke suggested they walk to the marshy area nearby to continue their conversation. Once there, the argument escalated. Zeke claimed that Katie's behavior became even more heated. At some point, he pulled out a knife that he always carried with him. He insisted he had no intention of hurting her, and only wanted to scare her enough to make her back off so he could leave. However, when Katie saw the knife, she allegedly lunged at him, striking his arm, which caused him to accidentally cut himself. A struggle ensued, and Zeke claimed he had no idea how the knife ended up in Katie's neck. Realizing she was no longer breathing, he panicked. Instead of calling for help, he went home and asked Joe for assistance without fully explaining what had happened. Joe, though clearly in shock, agreed to help hide the body. Together, they came up with an alibi and stuck to it. Since Giovanni Candelario had been staying at their apartment without anyone knowing, he was never questioned by the police during the initial investigation. The trial and verdict. When Katie's body was recovered from the shallow grave, the state of decomposition was so advanced that DNA testing had to be performed to confirm her identity. The forensic evidence, however, told a very different story than Zeke's version of events. The medical examiner discovered over a dozen knife wounds on Katie's body, including a fatal cut to her throat that was likely the cause of death. There was no plausible way to classify this as an accident. It was a brutal and intentional act. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Zeke continued to deny his guilt. He insisted it had been self-defense and that Katie had been wounded accidentally during their struggle. Investigators also determined that the final message sent to Katie's father from her phone had actually been written and sent by Zeke himself, an attempt to buy more time before anyone realized she was missing. During the trial, Zeke admitted that Katie had been following him and trying to interfere in his new relationship with Jamie Marlowe. However, he refused to acknowledge that he had intentionally harmed her. When asked why he had removed Katie's sneakers after her death, Zeke's response was chilling. He said the shoes were a gift for Jamie because she liked them, and he had wanted to make her happy. Jamie Marlowe testified in court as a witness. She admitted that she immediately recognized the sneakers Zeke had given her, and suspected they had belonged to Katie Cho. When she heard about Katie's disappearance, she said it became clear to her that Zeke had done something terrible. However, Jamie didn't go to the police because, as she explained, she was afraid of him. She faced no criminal charges and escaped legal consequences. Giovanni Candelario, who came forward with key information, was also not prosecuted and served only as a witness. Meanwhile, Joe Carpenter, Zeke's roommate who cooperated with investigators, received a suspended sentence for hiding evidence and giving false testimony. On July 26, 2011, Ezekiel Watkins was convicted of premeditated murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Zeke betrayed Katie twice, first by abandoning her for her best friend, and then by luring her to a remote spot where he took her life. How he managed to pass the polygraph test remains an unsolved mystery to this day. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.